Pronto? Okay. So, welcome to everybody. Welcome back to this wonderful hall of the Accademia delle Scienze di Torino. We are at the second section of this meeting, very interesting meeting. Brick and Symmetry, Aperiodic Crystallography meets Material Science. And now we are going towards application, towards material science in this second session this morning. So the first speaker unfortunately couldn't come to Turin and is connected by the net. So I introduce his name. Is Davide MANDELLI from the Forschungszentrum in Jülich. And he will tell us about tribology of incommensurate crystalline interfaces. So please, Davide, are you linked?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Davide MANDELLI, and I am a researcher at the Computational Biomedicine Institute at Forschungszentrum Jülich in Germany. In this presentation, I will show you some results obtained via molecular dynamic simulation, where I investigated some fundamental aspects of the tribology of incommensurate crystalline interfaces. Before starting, I would like to thank again the organizers for their kind invitation, and I apologize again for not being able to be there in presence. All the work that I will show have been done in collaboration mainly with my PhD supervisor, Elio Tosatti, and his collaborator, Andrea Vanossi, back at the SIS of Trieste, where I worked also in collaboration with Roberto Guerra and Nicola Manini, who are professors at the University of Milan. And if I have time, I will show also some results from projects done in collaboration with Professor Urbach and Professor Odd at the Tel Aviv University, where I worked also in collaboration with my colleague back then, Wengen, who is now professor at Wuhan University. Now, friction and tribology is one of the oldest branches of physics, started already by the first experiments and observation of Leonardo da Vinci. And it has become, again, a hot topic in the last few decades, and this is thanks mainly to the development of very sensitive experiments like the surface force apparatus, the quartz crystal microbalance, or the friction force microscopy that allow nowadays to perform tribological experiments under very controlled conditions, studying the tribology of single asperity down to the single atom asperity, or study the friction of atomically flat crystalline surfaces. Even at the nanoscale, and for such under such control conditions, a theoretical treatment of friction is still very hard, because even at this scale, dissipation is related to nonlinear mechanical instabilities, which involves many degrees of motion. So typically, one can approach this problem from a theoretical point of view by building minimal models able to capture the main physics of the underlying phenomena, or saying it with the words of Nobel laureate Andersen, one has to most of the time resort to the indignity of numerical simulation. But thanks to the recent developments in computer science, now we are actually able to perform very accurate simulations of real systems. Now, the specific topic I will deal with is that of solid-solid lubrication, of structural lubricity, which is the possibility of, explore the possibility of obtain lubrication or control friction between dry crystalline interfaces. Now, even between crystalline interfaces, the main source of dissipation is due to this type of very abrupt stick-slip motion, where the slider moves ahead in sudden jumps. And these, at the nanoscale, can be interpreted in terms of atomic interdigitation occurring between the two contacting crystals. So this suggests that one way of eliminating mechanical instabilities can be achieved by playing with the geometry of the interface, and in particular to build incommensurate interfaces that leads to this kind of frustrated systems where there is compensation of lateral forces, mechanical instabilities are eliminated, and one obtains more smooth and less dissipative kind of sliding. Now, studying the properties of such ideal crystalline surfaces, it is interesting from a fundamental point of view, but it has also potential applications, and I suggest that people are interested to read recent reviews like this one published in Nature a few years ago. Now, one of the minimal mathematical models that have been developed or used to study also friction between crystalline interfaces is the one-dimensional Frenkel-Kontorova model, which is depicted here. It consists of an harmonic chain of masses connected by springs, characterized by spring constant K and lattice spacing A. This represents a soft slider that interacts with a rigid crystalline substrate that instead described in terms of a sinusoidal potential with its own periodicity lambda and corrugation U. The static properties or the ground state configuration at rest of such a chain is trivial for the commensurate case. It is shown here, but it becomes the problem of finding the ground state becomes quite complicated for incommensurate interfaces, so irrational value of the ratio between A and lambda. And in particular, the ground state becomes very sensitive on the choice of the substrate potential, the amplitude of the substrate potential. And OBERTI, back in 1983, actually demonstrated that upon increasing the substrate potential, the ground state undergo a structural phase transition. I will not go into the details of the mathematics. I will just point to the main structural feature of this structural phase transition. That is the following. While below the critical corrugation, the probability of finding a particle arbitrarily close to the maximum of the substrate potential is always finite. This probability drops exactly to 0 above the critical point. So maxima are avoided and all the particles tend to condense within the minimum of the substrate potential. From the tribological point of view, this transition corresponds to a transition from a state of exactly 0 static friction, that has been mathematically demonstrated, to a state of finite static friction, and the transition is actually continuous or second order, so static friction increases continuously at the critical point. The existence of this 0 friction state is due to the existence of a 0 frequency phonon mode or Pason mode that adiabatically connects an infinite number of equivalent ground states. So this suggests that by building incommensurate crystalline structure, there is the possibility of achieving states of very low friction also in real systems. And the two questions that, let's say, inspired the works that I've performed during my PhD and later on in my postdoc are the following. So to what extent we can actually try to reproduce the physics of the Frenkel-Kontorova model in a real system, and to what extent we can use what we learned from this minimalistic model to interpret results obtained for real incommensurate systems. Now, an ideal platform to try to answer these questions is provided by charged particle crystals confined within optical lattice, where the charged particle crystal represents a slider, and the substrate potential that interacts with due to that it can be built with interfering laser provide the substrate corrugation potential. There are one-dimensional versions of such systems using ion chains, and also, and these are nanoscale system, and there are mesoscale system that can be built using colloidal particles, as shown here. Now, there are three main properties that make this system very attractive. The first one is that they are highly tunable, so playing with the intensity of the laser, one can tune the Aubrey-like parameters, so the corrugation potential, the periodicity of the optical lattice, and by tuning the confining potential that is needed to keep the charged particles together, one can play also with one can tune the lattice spacing of the charged particle crystal and the spring constant. So one can achieve commensurate, incommensurate interfaces, and in the case of 2D colloidal monolayers, there is also the possibility of exploring exotic interfaces with quasi-periodic substrate potential. Even in experiments using optical techniques, one can follow the position and velocity of each single particle. So even experimentally, one have access to the atomic details of what is going on. And third point is that there exist effective Hamiltonians that enable very accurate molecular dynamic simulation. So one can perform simulation that have match one-to-one with experiments and make some prediction that can be tested easily in experiments. So I will focus mainly on 2D colloidal monolayers, and I will start by discussing some results regarding the static properties and the dynamical properties of 2D incommensurate colloidal monolayers. Let's start with the static properties. So we ask ourselves what is the ground state configuration of a triangular lattice of charged colloidal particles interacting with a substrate potential of the same symmetry. Now, when compared to the one-dimensional case, of course, we have an additional degrees of freedom, and in particular, it is not known a priori which angular alignment corresponds to the state of lowest energy. The best way of visualizing the effect of misalignment angles between the colloidal crystal and the substrate is by looking at the Moiré pattern, which is shown here for different value of the misalignment angle theta. The Moiré pattern, what I'm showing here in each panel is a large portion of the colloidal crystal where each particle is colored according to the value of the substrate potential. In particular, black patches correspond to regions of the colloidal crystal where each particle is very close to energetically favorable region of the substrate potential corresponding to the minima of local minima of the substrate potential, while bright patches correspond to regions where colloidal particles are close to the maxima or energetically unfavorable region of the substrate potential. The geometry of the Moiré pattern is sensitive to the angular misalignment, and in particular, as we rotate away from the theta equals 0 configuration, the periodicity of the Moiré shrinks, and the Moiré also rotates. There are analytical expressions that can be given for the geometrical properties of the Moiré, which I spare you, but it is possible to derive them quite straightforwardly. And now, if we look at the evolution of the total energy of the system as a function of theta, which is shown here, we see that now different curves here correspond to different values of the substrate corrugation amplitude. So what we see is that there exists a clear minimum at a finite angle. To understand what is going on, we can look at the two components of the total energy. We can start by looking at the interparticle Coulomb repulsion energy within the crystal, which is shown in this panel here, which measure in some way the distortions present in the crystal. And we see that as we approach the optimal angle, the distortion, so the interparticle energy increases. But this increase in interparticle energy is more than is counterbalanced, is countered by a corresponding decrease in the interaction energy with the substrate potential, meaning that as we approach the optimal angle, the colloidal layer improves its interdigitation with the substrate. We can look even more details at what is going on. And here what I'm showing is the vector field that corresponds to the displacement of the particles from the unperturbed lattice to the fully relaxed one. And we see that for the theta equals 0 configuration, there are mainly longitudinal modes involved in these distortions, which are very costly and do not allow particles to move very much, trying to get closer to the minimum of the substrate potential. Instead, as we rotate the colloid, this vector field shows that distortion merely involve soft shear mode that allows relatively larger distortion, and so allow the colloidal monolayer locally to reach a better interdigitation with the substrate. These distortions are called mass density wave in surface physics, and actually the existence of an optimal misalignment angle for physics-orbit incommensurate monolayer is a result from the 70s by Novak and McTain, who were able also working within linear response theory to obtain an analytical expression for the optimal angle, which depends on ρ, which is the incommensurability ratio, so the ratio between the lattice spacing of the colloidal crystal and the lattice spaces of the substrate potential, and on another parameter delta that actually measures the relative stiffness of the longitudinal and transversal phonon modes. The predicted Novaco-McTague angle is shown here by this dashed line. As you can see, it matches pretty well the result from our molecular dynamics simulation when one takes into account finite size effect. Now, another thing that I would like to point your attention to is the following. If we follow the evolution of the interparticle potential energy on the substrate potential energy as for increasing corrugation, we see that the interdigitation gets better and better. So the substrate potential energy gets lower and lower while the interparticle energy increases. This suggests that what is going on is the colloidal are trying to get away from the maximum, trying to get as closer as possible to the local minima by exploiting these shear modes. And this is suggestive that a kind of OBERTI transition is going on. And in fact, if we continue increasing the substrate potential, we do observe a first order structural transition, which is signaled here in this plot by the presence of a jump of the interparticle Coulomb potential energy at the critical region, which jumps up, and the corresponding jump downward of the substrate potential energy. The total energy, which is shown here by the continuous line, it must be continuous, and shows a kink here, which is discontinuity in the first derivative. There is a signal of a first order phase transition. And again, what is happening at the critical point is that these shear modes are locally leads to a local rotation of the colloidal particle or the colloidal monolayer back into registry with the substrate potential. So here we see a snapshot on the left below the critical point where there are still particles on top of the maxima, of the substrate potential, as shown by the presence of these bright yellow dots, while on the right we see a configuration obtained above the critical point where these bright spots have disappeared, and we have a much larger regions or black regions that correspond to local commiseration with the substrate. So this is a clear sign of an OBERTI-like transition also into the colloidal monolayer, and we have other signature. So first of all, friction actually drops to 0 below the critical point, and then it jumps to a finite value above the critical point. And what I'm showing here is the more detailed analysis regarding the occupation of the maxima. So what I'm showing is one primitive cell of the substrate potential, and I have folded the positions of all the particles within the primitive cell, and this triangle, the region between these within these triangles correspond to the maximum of the substrate. As you can see, as the substrate potential is increased above the critical point, this region becomes completely avoided. One main difference with respect to the OBERTI transition is that in this case, the transition is first order instead of second order. Now, all these results were obtained at 0 temperature. We also tested finite temperature effect, and we observed that we found that this first order transition persist also at finite temperature. We studied the phase diagram. Here is a function of temperature and substrate corrugation potential. I'm using here W, but this is the same as U in previous slide. So, and there is a coexistent line that separates the superlubric or unpinned state at high temperature and low corrugation to the pinned with finite static friction state at low temperature and high corrugation potential. Actually, because of finite size effect, the coexistent line becomes a coexistent region, and course, we observe coexistence of these two phases within the same monolayer in our simulation, as shown here. And along the all coexistent line, we observe the same kind of OBERTI-like signature with avoidance of maximum of the substrate potential while going from below to above the critical point. The critical value of the substrate potential. The coexistent line, we observe that it ends up at a critical point, and we actually have some evidence that this is a critical point where the transition becomes second order by studying the hysteresis in the static friction measured ramping up and ramping down the substrate potential hysteresis that is present below the critical point, that the critical point completely vanish. We also study some susceptibilities and observe divergence of signature of divergence of susceptibility. So we have other hints that this is indeed a critical point for the OBERTI transition in finite temperature incommensurate monolayers. I will not go into the details, but after we published our results a few years later, the OBERTI transition has been actually observed for the first time in two-dimensional colloidal monolayer, showing the same features that we obtained in our simulation. I will now proceed by presenting some results on the dynamical properties of sliding incommensurate colloidal monolayers. And in particular, the connection or how we can control friction by controlling these mass density waves, so these equilibrium distortions of the fully relaxed static monolayer. What I'm showing in this plot here is a distribution of the interparticle distance within the layer for different misalignment angles. And as you can see, the distribution becomes broader as we approach the equilibrium, the optimal angle, so which is shown here in the middle, and then shrinks again. Now, upon sliding, this mass density wave, propagates within the monolayer, and large distortion corresponds upon sliding to leads to larger velocity fluctuation of the internal velocities of the particles. Now, the square of the velocity fluctuation is directly proportional to the frictional power dissipated upon sliding, and so this gives rise to a non-monotonic behavior of kinetic friction as a function of the angle theta, as reported here, where kinetic friction reaches a maximum at the optimal angle where these mass density waves, the intensity, these mass density waves are larger. So this suggests that kinetic friction in this regime, in the superlubric regime, is controlled by the equilibrium mass density waves. So to conclude this part, so I would just like to stress this final aspect, these final two aspects, so that incommensurate 2D monolayers display orientational epitaxy, so and that the kinetic friction is controlled by the angle-dependent intensity of the equilibrium mass density waves. These two are completely general results that are expected to hold also for any other incommensurate interfaces. And just quickly, I would like to show very briefly in the last minute or so how the same physics, especially the last point highlighted here, holds true also for heterogeneous interfaces, incommensurate interfaces formed between van der Waals layers, materials that are actually being used now trying to scale up structural lubricity for practical application. And in particular, what I have focused on are incommensurate graphene HBN heterojunctions. We have been collaborating with the experimental group in China, who have performed a frictional simulation of macro-scale flakes of graphite sliding on HBN, and what they observed is that, as expected, a very low kinetic friction independent on the normal load demonstrated that structural superlubricity can hold up to the micro-scale. And another interesting aspect, they performed also simulation as a function. They measure friction as a function of the orientational angle, and they found this 60-degree periodicity, which is actually connected again to the dependence of the mass density waves as a function of the angle. Again, I am almost out of time, so I will just point out to the main feature. In the case of graphite or graphene over HBN, these mass density wave correspond mainly to out-of-plane distortions, and these are shown here in this blue and white central row, which are maximized for the aligned case, hence the maximum of friction at a multiple of 60 degrees. And then as we rotate, they die off until for very large angles, there are no out-of-plane distortion anymore, which is consistent with the observation of very low friction at high misalignment angles. And I would like to show you the propagation of this mass density wave within the flake, in this case, upon sliding. So this is what the propagation of these moiré ridges is what leads to a dissipation under sliding and to this anisotropy of friction. And very last curious phenomenon that we observe, again, this dependence on the intensity of this mass density wave suggests a way of controlling friction by tuning them. And given that in the case of graphene over HBN, dissipation is due to the propagation of this out-of-plane distortion, one way of controlling them, we thought, would be by applying a load that would suppress them. And this is actually, this would lead to a counterintuitive effect where friction would reduce upon increasing the external normal load. And this is actually what we observed both in a minimalistic analytical model that we were able to build and also in full atomistic molecular dynamics simulation. Now, as strange as these can sound, actually negative friction coefficient have been actually observed also experimentally, and here I'm just highlighting one of the few papers where negative friction coefficients have been observed in real systems. And since I'm out of time, I will not go through the final slide, and I will just thank you all for your attention, and I wish you a successful continuation of the workshop.
So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Davide Mandelli.
Okay. Thank you very much to Davide for this interesting talk. It's a pity he could not come personally because he would have had more time for informal discussion on this interesting topic. But now it's time to go to the second speaker. The second speaker is Lara RIGHI from the University of Parma. Lara, please. And she will talk us about incommensurate structures in Heusler alloys.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for this opportunity to talk about my research work involving the last 20 years. So in this slide, I constructed the classical pictorial description of the multiferroic materials. So in principle, we can have material with spontaneous, for example, electric polarization or magnetic polarization or extended strengths. And for example, for electric polarization, we can switch this ordering, ferroic ordering, with the application of external electric field, magnetic field for ferromagnetic materials, or external mechanical stress in order to induce large strains. Multiferroism is related to materials where at least two ferroic ordering are coexisting. And for example, piezoelectric effect, we know that it is possible to induce the electric polarization by the application of a mechanical load. So we can combine the two ferroic effects by the application of the non-conjugate field. And this can also happen with the combination of strain with magnetic field. So we have the magnetoelastic effect, or in other materials we can combine electric polarization and magnetic polarization in so-called magnetoelectric effect. So we have few materials showing this type of complex combination of physical properties. And in the last years, for very few cluster of materials, we observed the interesting and detectable caloric effect during the ferroic ordering. That's why in the last years we saw papers dealing with electrocaloric effect, magnetocaloric effect, or elastocaloric effect. And then, if the animation is working, okay, we can see that we have few materials showing caloric effects that are suitable for some technological application in the field of cooling, okay, of devices performed by, for cooling. And another important point is that if we want to exploit caloric effects, it is important to combine at least two caloric. So multiferroics are the best option, of course, but then you can see that only, for example, only Heusler alloys are inside these two class of materials, so they show elastocaloric and also magnetocaloric effects, so they are one of the few material that in principle can show this combination of caloric effects. That's why Heusler alloys are considered as a prototypical of the multifunctional material. So I'd like to present the family of Heusler alloys. So we have more than 100 compounds in this class of intermetallics. And here we can see the classical structure of the Heusler superlattice. There is a sodium chloride-like ordering of at least two metals. One of the two must belong to the transition metal in the periodic table, and the second one necessarily must belong to the p block in the periodic table. Otherwise, it is impossible to build up the Heusler superlattice. The third atomic site can be occupied by all the metals that you can see here highlighted in blue. So you can see that we have many different combinations of metals to construct the Heusler type of lattice. The classical stoichiometry is the ratio 2:1:1, but we can find many other materials with off-stoichiometric composition, because in this way it is possible to tailor the characteristic temperatures of the solid-state transitions, the magnetic properties, and so on. One of the most studied and investigated materials is nickel-2 manganese gallium. We will see many results corresponding to this milestone of the Heusler alloy, and also other compositional variation around nickel-manganese gallium composition. So at the base of the physical properties of Heusler alloys, there is the Martensite transition. The Martensite transition is the solid-state transition from the parent phase, showing a cubic symmetry. It's a classical austenite. This is the classical name in metallurgy. And by going down with the temperature, we can observe the Martensite transition. So the martensite is characterized by a lower symmetry. This is the basic lattice. And so the symmetry can be tetragonal, orthorhombic, or eventually monoclinic. Every time the lattice is body-centered, and the different symmetry depends on the composition and on the temperature condition. Another way to induce the Martensite transformation is the application of a mechanical load on the austenitic phase. Okay. Here we can see the crystallographic relationship in between the two phases. In crystallography, classically, this distortion is called Bain distortion. It is common also to many other type of alloys. Also in steels, you can observe this type of transition and distortion from austenite to martensite. So if we consider one of the possible experimental way in order to study the Martensite transformation, we can see here the change of the magnetization of nickel-2 manganese gallium versus temperature. Because another important point of Heusler alloys is that they are ferromagnetic. So we have magnetic properties are related to a ferromagnetism. In some composition, it is not very clear the nature of the magnetic interaction. Sometimes the authors are indicating the possibility of having a ferrimagnetic interaction, but in principle, most of the Heusler alloys show a classical ferromagnetic ordering. So we can see here that the Curie temperature that corresponds to the transition from the austenitic paramagnetic state to the austenitic ferromagnetic state is quite high, so we are very far from the room temperature. And here we can see the hysteretical transition corresponding to the Martensite transition. So this kink is related to the presence of a so-called pre-Martensite transition. I don't want to go much in detail on this. We know that at this moment the matrix of the lattice is still cubic, but the symmetry changed because we can observe structural modulation. And but now what is very important is to look at the fact that the ferromagnetic ordering is present also in the Martensite phase, but the anisotropy is changed. So the magnetocrystalline anisotropy of the austenity phase, of the martensity phase is high, and you can see that the easy axis of the magnetization correspond to the unique axis in the martensity lattice. Okay, so nickel to manganese gallium is very known for this type of phenomena that you can see here in this movie. It is possible to obtain the complete magnetization of nickel to manganese gallium in the martensity phase in the very special way. So through the twinning process. So the magnetization proceeds with the motion of the twin boundaries instead of the classical rotation of the spins inside each magnetic domains. Classically, soft ferromagnets, in a soft ferromagnet you can obtain the magnetization by the rotation of the spins in each magnetic domains. But for what concerns Heusler alloys, and especially nickel manganese gallium alloys, we can obtain the same process, but with the twinning process, the twinning with the motion of the twin boundaries. The reason why we have this special property is unknown for several years, and it is called in two different ways. Magnetic shape memory is the classical name, or magnetic field induced strain. The strains that we can reach in this way are at least at 10%, and that's why in many cases it's called giant magnetic field induced strain. How was obtained this movie? So the authors put a piece of nickel to manganese gallium at low temperature, where the martensity phase is stable, and they apply a magnetic field that is rotating all around this piece of nickel to manganese gallium. The same effect can be obtained by the application of external external mechanical stress. So we have two different ways in order to detwin the martensite. One is by the application of an external magnetic field, or otherwise with the application of external mechanical load. Martensity phases in nickel manganese based Heusler alloys are often associated to the presence of structural modulation, and we can see here two electron diffraction patterns from two different types of nickel manganese gallium Heusler alloys, and classically the community of engineers and metallurgists are relating the number of satellites observed between the mere reflection that are correlated to the classical basic structure of martensite to some superstructure. The correlation is like this. So when we have 4 satellites, this modulated structure is called phi m. So the number of unit cells composing the supercell, the hypothetical superstructure, correspond to the number of satellites plus 1. And also another important family of modulated structure in nickel manganese gallium based Heusler alloys is the 7M, and in this case the modulated martensite shows 6 satellites. So this kind of structural modulation is not only observed in nickel, manganese, or other type of Heusler alloys, but we can see the same also in other martensity phases. I reported here only 3 examples in nickel aluminum, nickel titanium iron, in palladium iron. So in many martensity phases we have structural modulation, and in many cases the crystal structure is still unknown. Why we don't have the crystal structure of such modulated martensite? Because always you are observing the martensity transformation, you can see the formation also of a very complex microstructure. This is a classical tweed-like microstructure featuring a martensite phase. In this case, you can see that magnetic domains correspond exactly to the martensite twin domains. That's why we have this magnetic field-induced strain. And you can see here a lower projection of hypothetical single crystal of nickel-2 manganese gallium recorded. And you can see that we have a lot of different spots coming from different domains, so no chance to integrate intensity and have a reliable cluster of reflections in order to solve the crystal structure. So we tried to investigate the crystal structure of nickel-2 manganese gallium, the martensite phase of nickel-2 manganese gallium, but from literature the information is controversial because in many cases the martensite is associated to a tetragonal symmetry of the basis structure. The authors observe always 4 satellites, so that's why this modulated martensite is called Phi-M. But in other publications, in other papers, the same crystal structure is indicated as 7M because the powder diffraction pattern can be indexed on the basis of a 7-4 superstructure. So we collected in a lab diffractometer a diffraction pattern well below the martensite transformation temperature that for nickel-2 manganese gallium correspond to more or less 200 Kelvin. And we indexed the main reflections with an orthorhombic basis lattice instead of the tetragonal one. And the rest of the weak reflections were successfully indexed by the introduction of a modulation vector, very, very simple. We have only a single component along the C-star direction. But it was also clear that modulation is not commensurate because the Phi-M type of commensurate modulation require that the gamma parameter correspond exactly to 2/5, okay? And this is not the case, so the structure is not commensurate. So therefore, we apply the superspace approach. The symmetry of the crystal structure is here represented. We choose a very simple modulation function, and we refine a single parameter for the amplitude of this wave-like modulation function by constraining all the atomic sites to assume the same amplitude. Why this? Because in the intermetallics, in many cases, the structural distortion at the basis of an incommensurate structure is related to the shift of the atomic layers. And, we can see here the Rydberg plot obtained by the superspace approach. We were able to fit all the satellites, and by considering the refined modulation vector, we were able to take into account the fact that it's very close to this ratio. That's why it's possible to define a 7-4 superstructure corresponding to the incommensurate Phi-M type of superstructure. The simulation of the single crystal diffraction pattern show exactly 4 satellites. So that's why I call it this structure Phi-M incommensurate. We analyzed also another martensite phase affected by incommensurate modulation. In this case, we choose this combination of nickel manganese gallium. The martensite in this case is stable at room temperature. The symmetry in this case is monoclinic. And we applied more or less the same protocol. The modulation vector, again, is very simple. We have a monodimensional modulation. But in this case, we need to introduce also the second order of the modulation function. We have also some component along the Z coordinates. You can see here the good agreement between the modulation function and the electron density for, I think, nickel. And the value of the modulation vector, so the periodicity of the modulation vector is close to this ratio. So it is possible, again, to build up a commensurate three-dimensional crystal structure composed by 10 unit cells along the C-axis. And you can see very easily the shuffling of the atomic layers along this axis. And again, if we simulate a single crystal diffraction pattern coming from this commensurate model, we have 6 satellites. That is an agreement with the classical observation for what concerns the 7M type of modulation. So we achieved the crystallographic description of the modulated martensite phases in this family of Heusler alloys, but the community was quite cold because engineers and metallurgists are not very confident with the crystallographic description of this modulated martensite obtained by the application of this so complex crystallography. So for years and years, they still describing the symmetry as the trigonal for whatever type of nickel, manganese, gallium alloy, and this modulation was related to nano-twinning, so twinned domains with nano dimension, and they was considering this shift of the layers as the result of some twinning. Okay. Here you can see that in principle we were able to solve many different martensite phases that are modulated. More or less the features of the modulation are very similar. We found also a commensurate modulation with, in this case, a slight monoclinic distortion with different colors. Here in this table we can see the discrimination between 5M type of modulation or 7M type. And in red, I highlighted here the last martensite I analyzed. In this case, it's very, very difficult to obtain the crystal structure, to get the crystal structure, because the combination of nickel, manganese, titanium provide stones. So no way to break the alloy, have a polycrystalline sample, no way to have a single crystal, and we are working with plates. So it's very difficult to have a reliable reflection with reliable intensity. But the importance in having the proper symmetry and the crystallographic description of the modulated martensites came clear after this work. In this case, these authors analyzed the same alloy I used in order to solve the 7M type of modulation, and they adopted this classical way to analyze with electron-based scattering diffraction a portion of a martensite phase, showing this complex microstructure. Each colored portion corresponds to a twinned domain, so we have 4 different type twins, and this was possible. So this classification was possible after the successful indexing of the Kikuchin lines, and the successful indexing was possible by adopting the tenfold superstructure obtained by the superspace approach. So we can see that we have a different orientation. Each color corresponds to a different crystallographic orientation of the twinned domains. And again, it was possible to identify each boundary between 2 different domains of the martensite by applying the so-called deformation twinning theory, that was formulated by B.B. Crocker in the 60s, I think. So I don't want to go much in detail in describing this theory. It is quite complex, but it is possible for each boundary to obtain these crystallographic operators. And for what concerns the type 1 boundary that is observed, for example, between B and D domains, okay, the blue and the green ones, or, for example, AC, so between the purple and pink domains, we have twinning symmetry operators corresponding to a mirror, and the boundary show these Miller indexes. For type 2, we have a rotation around this axis, and the boundary corresponds to these Miller indexes. For compound twin, we have these symmetry operators, but you can see that the boundary corresponds to this combination of Miller indexes. What is very important now is that we have to recall that the easy axis of the magnetization corresponds to the B axis in the monoclinic setting. So this means that the compound twinning boundaries are inactive because we don't have a component along the B axis. They are parallel with respect to the easy axis. So no way to move such boundary by the application of external field. Otherwise, type 1 and type 2 are magnetic field induced strain active. And just after this result, it was possible to grow martensite phases by selecting only the twin boundaries active. And you can see here nice experiments where these samples come from a single research group in Finland. They are able to grow martensite crystals with selected twin boundaries. They selected, for example, in this case, type 1 or type 2, or in this case, crystals with two domains separated by or type 1 or type 2 boundary. And here you can see nice experiments where the strain, so that the twinning process was obtained by the application of external stress. The same happens also with the application of a magnetic field. And we can see that type 2 is much more mobile with respect to type 1 because we can apply a very slow, very small stress in order to obtain really large strains you can see. In this case, in this paper appearing in 2020, the authors report the presence of 12% of strain. This is a very giant strain. And again, they are able to measure the boundary displacement through this crystalline sample. So they can measure the displacement of the boundary under the application of a mechanical stress. This is possible only after the knowledge of the symmetry and the correct periodicity of the crystal structure of nickel, manganese, gallium, martensite phases, of course. So now I'd like to recall that Heusler alloys are interesting for a variety of different physical properties. And in one case, magnetocaloric and elastocaloric effects are important for the transition from austenite to martensite induced by the application of a magnetic field or a mechanical stress. In this frame, it is important to understand what happens to the martensite transformation when it is triggered by the application of a mechanical stress. And for this purpose, we investigated again nickel to manganese gallium. In this case, we obtained from the Finland group a nice single crystal with this cylindrical shape. The grow direction was 001. You can see here this picture representing the crystal. And we fabricated a homemade clamp to accommodate the single crystal, you can see here, in order to apply a uniaxial compression in order to trigger the martensite transition. I recall that the martensite transformation temperature is around 200 Kelvin. So our proposal was to induce the transformation at room temperature by the application of a mechanical load. Everything was really, how to say, analogical, because we put this clamp in the wish diffractometer that is located at the Target 2 station at ISIS, a large facility, because we use time-of-flight neutral diffraction to collect single crystal pattern. And we rotated by hand, this clamp with the crystal by 90 degrees in order to explore larger portion of the reciprocal space. How we work? We work with keep a constant uniaxial stress and by changing the temperature, moving the temperature, or eventually by keep the temperature constant and moving the mechanical load. Okay, so you can see here a picture of the wish beam line. The sample order was located. 2 minutes. Okay, I have time enough to close, to end my presentation. And And here we can see the preliminary results. So we were almost able to stabilize martensite at room temperature. You can see that the distortion and the corresponding satellites appear at 270 Kelvin. And you can see that around the spots corresponding to the main reflection, we have 4 spots. Why? Because we are constraining the martensite transition by selecting the C-axis, but the twinning that is correspond to the switch of the A-B axis is impossible to avoid. So that's why we have 4 satellites around, but they come from 2 domains. And this is a lucky condition, so at least 2 domains is okay. And by going down with the temperature, we can see that the intensity of the satellites grow up. So by looking at the evolution of the intensity of the satellites with respect to the intensity of the main reflection, so we are now observing a single row of spots, we can see that the intensity of satellites grow up as the temperature is going down under 245 megapascal of uniaxial compression. So our interpretation of this is that probably under these conditions, the modulation is not harmonic, is not a wave-like type of distortion, but looks like an anharmonic type of modulation with a discontinuous modulation function. And this is the same that we observed in another system. In this case, we analyzed a time-of-flight diffraction pattern at room temperature for this alloy, and we found that the best fitting of the powder diffraction pattern was obtained by the introduction of a discontinuous modulation function. You can see here the nice representation of the Fourier map with, in this case, it was possible to build up a 3-fold superstructure, and then you can see the shear of the planes and the sudden change of the direction of the shear. And here you can see, they are really preliminary results, so it's not the last and the best probably fitting, but you can see how complex is the diffraction pattern, and the intensity of some satellites is comparable to main reflections. So I conclude my presentation. I have many people to thank, but a special thank is for Fabio Orlandi, my past PhD student, now instrument science at Jülich Line, and of course I'd like to thank all of you for your attention.
So thank you, Lara, for your clear and very interesting talk. Unfortunately, I'm compelled to delay the discussion to the coffee break. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much also for coming. And now it's time for the 3rd speaker of this morning, Professor Arianna LANZA, now at the University of Copenhagen after a long trip among Europe. And she will talk us about electron diffraction methods to reveal the structure of aperiodic nanocrystals.
So, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I hope I will not taint the name of the Accademia. So here I will take you to a journey to see how the experiments are done to determine the structure of these aperiodic crystals, and especially when the crystals we have are too small for X-ray diffraction. So we are using electron radiation, which interacts with matter much more strongly than X-rays. So this means that we can get meaningful data, so strong enough data with good information also from nano-sized domains of our sample. So we are talking about samples smaller than 1 micron. And even though when we think about crystals, we can think about things you can see and admire, but nature doesn't always give us this luxury. Many times we find a new mineral, for example, we have this morphology, very small quantity of very small needles, for example. Or, as we've seen also yesterday, minerals can be embedded in a rock, and the crystalline domains that we want to analyze might be very small. And it's not only minerals. Actually, we can find nanocrystals also in some living organisms. So here on the right, you can see protein crystals that grow inside living cells. Or there are some animal species that look shiny, that use nanocrystals in their tissues to create optical effects like reflectivity or color change, just depending on the size and shape and arrangement of these nanocrystals. Then we can have small crystals also in our synthetic laboratories. So for example, many times when we do this solid state synthesis, we cannot always grow the 3 millimeter crystal that we have just seen, but we can have a complex mixture of very small grains. And that was also how the first quasi-crystals were prepared. And sometimes the crystals are very small as a consequence of a transformation, for example, like dehydration or a phase transition that is so changing the structure so much that it breaks down into small crystals. So these crystals are too small for X-ray diffraction, but we can analyze them with the transmission electron microscope. So here we are using an electron beam that we can, because electrons are charged with electromagnetic lenses, we can precisely control the shape, the diameter, the focus, and even the position of the beam. On the other hand, electrons interact with everything, so this instrument is in high vacuum. And when we illuminate a sample with a beam of high-energy electrons, many interactions occur at the same time. We can look at some of them. So, for example, we can look at the elastically scattered electrons, which, if our sample has long-range order, the elastically scattered waves will interfere with each other, and this is what gives the diffraction pattern. So, this is what we can use for crystallographic analysis. But because this instrument is actually a microscope, we have lenses after the sample, and we can even recombine these diffracted beams to form an image which is very magnified. Then we can also look at some of the inelastic interactions. For example, so when the electron beam is partially absorbed and some excess energy is emitted, for example, the sample can emit X-ray fluorescence, and we can do then energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. So, in short, basically, with the transmission electron microscope, we can see the sample, we can determine the three-dimensional or more crystal structure, and we can also do locally chemical analysis. So all these analysis on the very same spot region of our sample, whereas otherwise I would need 3 different instruments. So this all works well as long as our sample is very thin. So again, thin, I mean smaller than a micron, much smaller than a micron, because we are working in transmission mode, so the sample must be electron transparent. And then we must be able to control the position and also to rotate our sample to do our 3-dimensional analysis. So how do we prepare a thin sample? Well, we have just seen that in some cases we have a solid sample that is already made by small particles, so the grains of our powder sample can be less than 1 micron. And then it's very easy to prepare the sample. We can just disperse it on a very thin support grid. You can see it looks like everything is very small. The grid itself is just 3 millimeters. You can see the blue crystalline grains here dispersed on this film, and just all the grains that we see here are actually too big for electron microscopy and diffraction, but we have many more that are much smaller. And just to compare, if you want to do X-ray diffraction, for example, you need to grow a crystal in proportion of this size, so several tens or better, hundreds of micrometers. But we have seen in some cases we have a bulk sample, for example, the rocks, the meteorites, and so on. So in this case, we need to find the region of interest of our bulk sample, and then we can use a focused ion beam to very precisely cut a cross-section of this sample to have a very thin lamella that we can analyze with transmission electron microscopy. So you can see here, it's a prepared lamella from a multi-layer sample, and you see after the preparation you can still see the layers, and on the other hand the lamella is very thin, it's tens of nanometers. So let's see some of the analysis we can do on this sample. So we have seen that when the electrons interact with the sample, the atoms can be excited and re-emit the X-ray fluorescence, and so we can just insert an X-ray detector in the proximity of our sample and analyze this emission. So the X-ray fluorescence is extremely characteristic, is like a fingerprint of every atom type. So we can separate these emitted X-rays in energy, and we can then identify the atom types. And also with suitable calibration, we can also do a quantification. So we have our chemical analysis. And because we have said we can precisely control the position of the beam and make it very small, then we can scan the beam over an area, and basically we collect the EDX pattern for every pixel of the image, so we can make a map of where the elements are, so which we can see if the crystals are all the same or if they have different composition, for example. And if we do the quantification, we can see in a bulk sample where are the domains with the composition that we are interested in. It could be a new composition, and that's, again, throwback time when we found the quasi-crystals in a matrix of aluminum, right? So now we can choose where to do our further analysis, in which region. And we have said we have an electron microscope, so we can see the things. If we magnify enough, and we focus enough, we can actually see the atoms. So this is an example where this very complex oxide has some excess oxygen, which is this delta. So it's a non-stoichiometric compound, and there is some excess oxygen atom that goes and occupies some interstitial site in the structure. So it's clear to see that when there is the oxygen atom, all the other atoms around have to move, shift to accommodate for it. So we have occupational modulation due to the presence or absence of the oxygen, and then displacing modulation of all the other atoms. And if you count the dots here, you will see that these waves are not periodic compared to the lattice of the crystal structure. So here we are really seeing the atoms with our eyes, and that seems perfect way to determine the structure, right? So microscopy is really powerful. But of course, what I showed you before is an exceptional result. So we need to have a very high-end instrument, a very good control of the conditions, and the beam, everything, the sample must be very smooth, very flat, very perfect, very clean. So everything must be controlled to high level. But let's say we have the best instrument, the best sample, and also the best microscopist. Still, what we are seeing is a 2D projection of at least 3D structure. So, because we are working in transmission mode. So this, yes, it's a real image of in real space, but can be difficult to interpret. So we can look at what we can do with diffraction instead. So here we can collect the diffraction pattern from specific regions of our sample. We can insert a physical aperture in the instrument to delimit the area where we want to collect the diffraction pattern, because the diffraction will be then is caused by the average of all the scattered electrons from this region. So it's giving us average information, which is actually its strength. And we can precisely control the orientation of our sample, so to find where we have the orientation that gives us the most symmetric patterns. So, and again, this is how the quasi-crystals were discovered with selected area electron diffraction. When we have seen some of these patterns also before, so we can use them to, for example, compare phases. When they are similar, we can see these phases share the same basic lattice, but here we have many extra peaks. So this is a hint that it's some sort of modulated structure. And we can also measure the distances in the reciprocal space, and from this we can, if we know the orientation of the sample, we can derive the unit cell parameters or any set of vectors that we need to describe our reciprocal lattice. So diffraction is, in principle, more robust analytical method because it's more forgiving. So because it's averaging everything, it's less sensitive to imperfection, to little misalignments, to vibrations. So it's, let's say, easier to obtain than high-resolution images. Also, you need a less high-end instrument. On the other hand, it's still 2D information in a way. So to see, to have an idea of the third dimension, we need to rotate the crystals, and ideally we would like to rotate in all directions. Ideally we would like to rotate 90 degrees, but because of the hardware, because of the experimental setup, it's not possible to rotate 90 degrees, for example. And also when we measure different patterns at different orientations, we have still we are missing out on many regions of the reciprocal space. So we have basically incomplete data, and it's very difficult to determine a 3 or more dimensional structure with incomplete data set. We need prior knowledge. So the natural prosecution of this experimental approach would be to collect as much as possible of the reciprocal space with continuous rotation of our sample. So in this case, we can sample a much larger region with fine step and get more complete data. So those of you that are X-ray crystallographer will be unimpressed because that's what we do with X-ray diffraction all the time, right? We rotate the crystal in many directions and get more than complete data. But this was not so easy to do with electron diffraction so far, because mostly experimental limitations, but we have seen a very rapid growth of the three-dimensional electron diffraction approach in the recent years, because we have seen technological advancement, importantly of the detector, and also on the sample rotation stability, and then automation of the data collection, so that everything can be very fast. So I show you a quick animation. Things must be very fast because the electron beam is very high energy, so many materials suffer strong beam damage when exposed to the beam, so we have to be able to collect meaningful data before the crystal is too damaged. And another thing is that, as we said, the instrument is high vacuum, so this can also alter our structure or cause some damage, but we can actually mitigate this by, for example, cooling down the sample. Here we have the diffracted beams around our transmitted beam, and this diffraction pattern can be collected very rapidly with the new generation of detectors that are hybrid pixel, and they can collect even the single electron that is scattered by our sample. So we need just a weak illumination to have a large data set of diffraction patterns. So I would like to show you a couple of examples that show again what is the origin of the modulation inside the structure. And I think they are easy to understand, which is nice. So this is one of those cases of those minerals that appear like a hair, a bunch of hair. And this, I mean, it could be worse. These crystals actually, when we do micrographs, we see that we have a well-formed crystal, but the well-diffracting domains are actually smaller than a micron. You see several hundreds of nanometers. This mineral, I didn't say, it's called daliranite, and it's a nice blend of lead, mercury, arsenic, and sulfur, so tasty. And it was previously analyzed with selected area electron diffraction, and we see that it diffracts very well. And there was a unit cell proposed from this. But still, to solve the structure, we need to do three-dimensional electron diffraction. So here we could find easily the unit cell from the dimensional data. Actually, the unit cell is different. When you look at the whole data, you get the correct one. And also, the formula turns out to be a bit different from what was initially determined, so from the structure, and then again confirmed from locally energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, we can see that the formula actually contains only 5 sulfur, not 6. So this is also the importance of being able to perform the chemical analysis exactly on the crystal that you are diffracting, so you can correlate best. So here we have an assembly of lead, big capped trigonal prisms, some distorted octahedra of mercury, and then we have our arsenic that coordinates sulfur, 3 sulfur atoms, and forms trigonal pyramids. But you can see from the structural model here, something looks split, looks double, because actually in the space group symmetry there is a mirror plane, and these arsenic atoms are a bit frustrated because they are not at the suitable distance to coordinate both the sulfur above and the sulfur below at the same time, for example. So they have to choose, and they have to choose these 2 positions above or below the mirror plane. And this is the average structure, so we could say that this is disorder over the 2 possible sites. And in the structure, our pyramids can point up or point down, depending on the position that it's occupied. But if we look at the reciprocal space, we see that our yellow unit cell here is not explaining all the peaks. So we have satellite peaks that are indicating there is some modulation going on, and we need an extra vector to index these peaks. So only one, fortunately. So this is a monodimensional modulation. We just need 3 + 1 dimensions. So you see the component here of our modulation vector is this strange number. Is not 1/3, is not 1/4. It's, I think, like a 5/19. So it's an irrational number. This also tells us that the modulation is incommensurate. Good. From this, with the superspace approach, we can determine the incommensurately modulated model. And so here in the center, you see a supercell of the average structure. So you know to compare, we need to grow multiple cells to see actually how the things change in the incommensurate modulation. And with the different lighting, you can see that different pyramids pointing up or down are differently shaded. So you can see that while in the average structure they all look the same, could be up or down regardless. Here in our incommensurate model, some pyramids are up, and some pyramids are down. So, and there is not a clear rationale for which is up, which is down. So it's actually aperiodic in this direction, and it's periodic in the other directions. So this is, again, the origin of the modulation is the frustration of the arsenic. So it's a displacive modulation. The arsenic can be either up or down, and it's occupying these 2 positions with a discontinuous modulation function. And in doing so, the arsenic is actually dragging along all the other atoms. So they also respond with the displacive modulation, even though to a lesser extent, not so, but it's still half an angstrom or 0.3, 0.4. So all the atoms are modulated, and they are described with their modulation function. I have another example, which is not something I personally analyzed, but it's extremely cool, and because it's showing you how the modulation is also explaining the function of the material. So this is an oxide ion conductor, which could be a battery material, for example. Here, it's you see, it's again cerium niobate with excess oxide, and they synthesize the 4 different phases with a different amount of excess oxide, and this is compensated by the easy oxidation of cerium 3+ to cerium 4+. So if we look at the extreme structure, so the stoichiometric one without excess oxide and the one with which is the most oxygen-rich, we can see that in the second one we have extra oxygen, which is occupying some interstitial sites, and it's here in blue. And both structures are actually ordered. So you see from the pattern, this is selected area electron diffraction, you see that there is an underlying square pattern common to all phases, but we have extra peaks here. So this is a superstructure of the basic non-doped cerium niobate. But it's commensurate, so it's an order structure. And this intermediate composition is a commensurate modulation. So not interesting. So we can look at this other one with the very low amount of oxygen. We see that we have some weaker intensities around each peak. So these are our satellite peaks that we need 2 additional vectors to index all the peaks. So in this case, we have to use 3 + 2 dimensions. And it's an incommensurate modulation. And actually, this sample diffracts exceptionally well. You can see satellite peaks to very high order. So they solved the incommensurately modulated structure, which, again, by by seeing it over multiple unit cells, we can compare it with the average stoichiometric compound. So you see, first of all, the presence or not of this oxygen atom in blue, in the interstitial oxygen atoms. And again, we see that all the other atoms have to accommodate for them. So you see very clearly the oxygen, the red ones, they are moving a lot, but also actually even the metals are moving. And so everything now is described by modulation functions. This now we know very much in detail all the structure of all 4 phases. And this allows then to study the function. So we have also seen earlier this morning molecular dynamic simulation. In this case, they are carried out to examine the diffusion of atoms in the lattice. So every time you see a connected red trajectory, for example, is indicating that the oxygen can diffuse throughout the lattice. And you see, it depends on the amount of extra oxygen and depends on the structure. So we have no migration in the case when we don't have any extra oxygen, any interstitial oxygen. But it's very clear in these 2 intermediate phases. And on the other hand, we have almost no migration also in the oxygen-rich phase, because the interstitial oxygen actually to migrate, it needs to find empty positions nearby, and when it's too much oxygen, there are too few extra empty positions. And also the structure here is more rigid, so no migration. So from these simulations, we can calculate the diffusion coefficient and then see that this phase, for example, is much more a good conductor than this phase. So we can see that from the detailed structure, we can calculate properties and then in the applied case, optimize the performances. So I hope I showed you that with the transmission electron microscope, we can do a very valuable analysis, because we can see the sample, we can determine the structure, and we can do chemical analysis all on the same spot. And also we need a very small sample. On the other hand, the drawback is that we actually are only analyzing a very small sample, so it needs to be, we have to make sure that it's representative of our bulk sample if you want to generalize, for example, the properties. Then we have seen that because of the experimental conditions, this is not suitable for all kind of materials due to the vacuum and the high beam energy. But recently we have seen the appearance on the market of electron diffractometers, which these instruments are always still based on electron beam and electromagnetic lenses, but they are optimized for diffraction. So we cannot zoom in and see the atoms with high resolution, but we can collect as complete as possible data set of diffraction patterns, and these are optimized so that we need only low illumination, so we minimize beam damage, and we can analyze many kinds of samples, from minerals to intermetallics, to organics, and to proteins. And we use the methods and software that we normally use for X-ray crystallography. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, everybody who supported me before this day, but also I want to leave you with some suggestions. So if this thing sparked your interest in electron crystallography, you can find some online courses. This one is very interactive, very easy, and this is the hardcore version for those of you that like this. If you want to read about the evolution of electron diffraction, there is this very comprehensive review. We will tell you all the different methods And this is the best textbook for electron microscopy. It's very a pleasure to read. And finally, of course, you can go or send a student to electron crystallography school because we organize them regularly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Arianna. Your results are really exciting. There is time for a very quick question, if any. No? So I want to finish this session with a very general comment. Maybe it's strange for, I would say, an old-style single crystal crystallographer as I am. I was really excited to hear about the development of techniques and results due to the study of these very complex periodic materials. So thank you so much to all the speakers. And so now it's time for the coffee break, and we will meet again at 11:30.